It's wonderful that you've all made it, and we're deeply grateful that you've chosen to spend your evening, or part of your evening, here at the Art Institute for what will, I can guarantee, be a fascinating and informative lecture. My name is Jeff Nigro. I am a research associate in the Department of Ancient and Byzantine Art at the Art Institute, and I also administer the Boschel Foundation Lecture Series, which this lecture is a part of. The Boschel Foundation Lecture Series is very generously sponsored by the Boschel Family Foundation, and I want to thank in particular our very good friends Ned and Raynette Boschel, who have so generously sponsored this series, which supports the presentation of lectures on topics of broad popular appeal and to stimulate interest in the arts and cultures of the ancient world. The Boschels are traveling, so unfortunately cannot be with us this evening, but I would ask you to please join me in thanking them for their generosity in supporting this series with a round of applause. This evening's program is a bit of an exciting departure for the Boschel Foundation lecture series. Typically, these lectures have been dedicated to the arts and cultures of the ancient Mediterranean world, but we're going a little further afield from there, but a little closer to home this evening, because one of the other things we like to do with this lecture series is to observe significant historical anniversaries. In this case, the 500th anniversary of Hernan Cortez's arrival in Mexico. In keeping with the Art Institute's commitment to presenting a diversity of voices and perspectives, we will be looking at this culture, not at the culture of the Europeans who came to this part of the world, but to one of the indigenous civilizations that already was flourishing here. Yes, absolutely. We're all for that. It's also true that the Boschel Lecture Series has brought speakers from all over the United States and beyond. But sometimes the ideal scholar to address the topic at hand is one of our own, one of our neighbors and colleagues right from within this city, and that is certainly the case with our distinguished speaker this evening. Our speaker is Claudia Brittenham, Associate Professor of Art History and the College at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on the art of ancient Mesoamerica, and her most recent book is the Murals of Cocachla, The Power of Painting in Ancient Mexico, which appeared in 2015. Her lecture this evening is actually connected to her current book project, Unseen Art, Vision and Memory in Ancient Mesoamerica, which explores problems of visibility and the status of images in Mesoamerica, ranging from carvings on the undersides of Aztec sculptures, we'll see an example of that, at least, well, more than one example of that this evening, to Maya lintels and buried Olmec offerings. It examines the distance between ancient experiences of works of art and the modern practice of museum display. Dr. Brittenham is active in the Global Ancient Art Initiative within the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago, as well as in the Katz Center for Mexican Studies, the Center for Latin American Studies, and the Institute for the Formation of Knowledge. She is also a member of the Proyecto La Pintura Mural Prehispánica en México of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Her lecture this evening explores the ways in which a civilization that may seem old to us looked back even further for inspiration to the civilizations that preceded it. And her talk is entitled, Aztec Art and the Fragility of Empire. Please welcome Claudia Brittenham.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that generous introduction. I'd also like to thank the Ned and Raynette Boschel and the Boschel Family Foundation for sponsoring this event. And I want to thank all of you for coming out on this really miserable day. It's Halloween, no less, to think just a little bit about the Aztecs. Before beginning, though, I want to acknowledge, as the Art Institute has recently informally acknowledged, that we're gathered here together on the traditional territory of the Council of the Three Fires, which consists of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and that for a long time now, and continuing today, Chicago, now Chicago, has been a place where many different Native American groups have gathered, and that it is still home to one of the most vibrant Native American communities in the United States today. Now, what we're going to be talking about in ancient Mexico is admittedly a little bit far from Chicago when we're thinking about the Aztec Empire with its home in Tenochtitlan, right underneath modern-day Mexico City. But I really like to imagine that maybe somebody in Tenochtitlan knew somebody who knew something about somebody who knew something about Chicago, and vice versa, all the way down, because we know that people and ideas moved freely throughout North America, and that there were these very widespread networks. Not necessarily that a lot of people made the round trip, but certainly people knew people who knew people who knew people that connected this entire region. And we certainly know, just from modern experience, it's not too far to walk from one of these places to the other. Now, 2019 is a year of a number of different anniversaries. We've been thinking a lot recently about 1619 and the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in what would become the Jamestown colony. And this is, one of the foundational moments in our history. But what I want to do today is go back even a little bit further to the anniversary of 1519, the 500th anniversary of the arrival, or perhaps better, invasion of the Spanish. And here I show you an image, an indigenous view of what that arrival looked like from Book 12 of the Florentine Codex, a collaborative project between Fray Bernardino de Sahagún and a number of indigenous collaborators. And the 12th book of it is dedicated to this account of the arrival of the Spanish and the things that happened thereafter. So a lot of us, Mesoamericanists, scholars of colonial Latin America this year, have been thinking a lot about that initial moment of encounter and what it might have been like for both of these parties to encounter such an unfamiliar, and yet at the same time strangely familiar civilization on the other side of that ocean. And I've been thinking and reading Cortez's letters and Bernal Diaz's account and other accounts and thinking about exactly what happened during those first few years. And so we see Cortez setting off to sail from Cuba in on November 18th in 1518. Hitting land by March and along the coast of Tabasco right here by March and April of 1519, founding the Villarica de Veracruz on June 3rd of that year, and then beginning that inexorable march inland to the center of Mexico. Cortez was beginning to hear already about rumors of a great city and a great empire. When he stopped in Potonchan, here in Tabasco, he was given gifts by emissaries of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma. Among those gifts were 20 enslaved women, one of whom we now call her Malintzin or Malinche, spoke Nahuatl and Maya. One of Cortez's band, Jerónimo de Aguilar, had been shipwrecked on the Yucatan. He spoke Maya and Spanish. And with the arrival of Malinche, a chain of communication became possible, where everything got translated from language into language, And as we'll see, Malinche was pictured so centrally, we played such a central role in this project of conquest, in this project of encounter, that Cortez himself was sometimes even called Malinche. But by this time, 500 years ago, The coast was far behind, and Cortés had begun marching with his men on a circuitous and sort of intentionally circuitous, Montezumba's messengers kept on trying to steer him away from the capital, route through to the center of Mexico. In the month of September, he entered the city-state, the Altepetl of Tlaxcalan, corresponding more or less to the modern state of Tlaxcala in Mexico, and where he began in earnest to recruit indigenous allies. If you look at this map on the lower part of the screen that shows the geographic extent of the Aztec Empire in 1519, you'll notice that it extends from coast to coast, from Atlantic to Pacific, but that it's not an entirely contiguous empire, right? There's a little branch down here in Soconochco where people are getting the chocolate, because you can't really have a good empire without chocolate. I think we can all agree on that. But you'll also notice this gap in Aztec or Mexica imperial control in what is Tlaxcala, right in the center. And so when Cortés arrived in Tlaxcala, he found the natural enemies of the Aztecs, the natural enemies of the Mexica, and the enemy of one's enemy is sometimes one's friend. I realize I'm already doing something that might be confusing, which is switching between the word Aztec, which is our word for describing all of the Nahuatl-speaking people and describing this great empire that arose between 1300 and 1519 in the center of Mexico, and Mexica, which is the word that the leaders of that Aztec empire would have used to describe themselves. They were the citizens of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, and that was the name of their city, the name of their city-state, the name of their group, and I'll continue to switch between those two terms. So, in Tlaxcala in September, Cortés acquires allies, and with those allies, he passes from Tlaxcala into the city, and here we see that indicated by Tizatlan, into the city known as Tolan, which we might now call Cholula. And right about this date, depends on, if you're going to correct for the Gregorian-Julian calendar correlation, occurs one of the shocking acts of violence of the Spanish invasion, a massacre at Cholula during one of these feast days where Cortés, his Spanish soldiers, and his indigenous Tlaxcaltecan allies massacred women, children, and men during one of Cholula's feasts. And you'll remember, and we see here this depicted in a 19th century copy of a 16th century account called the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, a compilation by Tlaxcaltecans describing their service to the Spanish crown. And relevant to what we've just been saying, you can see here Malintzin or Malinche standing and directing the action. Nobody forgets her role in the 16th century. Within another month, by November 8th, Cortés, his hundreds of Spanish soldiers and about 40,000 Tlaxcaltecan allies had arrived in the city of Mexico, Tenochtitlan. And I'm showing you here a map of Tenochtitlan. Cortés was very good at publicizing what he had done. And so we see here a map of Tenochtitlan that was published in a printed account of one of his second letters to Charles V of Spain, as he was describing what he had seen and what he had claimed in the name of the Spanish crown. This particular hand-colored version of the map is in the collections of the Newberry Library here in Chicago. We're very fortunate to have it here. And when they first arrived in Mexico, Tenochtitlan, the Spanish had a feeling of wonder at the city that they saw. And I want to read you Bernal Diaz's famous words describing that first encounter. Bernal Diaz, of course, is writing 50 years later, but still that first sight of the city that was seared into his mind. During the morning, we arrived at a broad causeway and continued on our march towards Iztapalapa. And when we saw so many cities and villages built into the water and on dry land, and that straight and level causeway going towards Mexico, we were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and temples and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. There was a real sense of wonder at the encounter with this marvelous city of Tenochtitlan. And yet things quickly changed. By November 14th, Moctezuma, the Aztec Emperor, had been taken prisoner. He lived a captive of the Spanish for a mere 6 or so months until he died. Exactly how is contested. Cortez says that it was citizens of Tenochtitlan who killed him, but I've always had my doubts. He dies around June 29th of 1520. The Spanish are expelled from the city on the Noche Triste not long after, June 30th, and then retreat to Tlaxcala, make friends once again with their Tlaxcalan allies, and come back, build boats, brigantines within the lake, at whose center Tenochtitlan lies, lay siege to the city, and Tenochtitlan falls on August 13th, 1521. In the years after the Spanish invasion, a series of traditions developed talking about omens and signs and portents that Moctezuma and other inhabitants of Tenochtitlan saw in the years before the Spanish invasion. I'm showing you here from Diego Duran's Historia de las Indias. I'm showing you here an image of one of the comets that is said to be one of these omens. Now, following Diana Magaloni, I'm moderately convinced that the omens are, in fact, a colonial tradition, that they are an effort on the part, largely of indigenous people, to make sense of the terrible disruption that had just happened, to begin to think about and imagine a story in which how this could have come to be. But the idea that the world might end and begin anew, that there was not just one creation, but multiple creations. The idea that the Aztec Empire, in spite of all of its glory and accomplishments, would come to an end. That was not an idea that would have been a surprise to anyone living in Mexico Tenochtitlan before the Spanish invasion. In fact, almost all Mesoamerican peoples believed that the world had been created not once, but many times. That the gods would attempt to make the world and attempt to make humans, and in some way it would be unsatisfactory, and the humans would be, the people perhaps not humans, the people would be destroyed or they'd be converted into animals, and then there would start a new creation, a new sun. The world would be set in motion again. And the Aztecs, we know, believed that too. And we can see that this monument, sometimes called the calendar sun, or the calendar stone or the sunstone, makes that claim. But it makes that claim in a tremendously bold way. While most Mesoamericans might say that they lived in the second sun or the third sun or the fourth sun, what the Aztecs asserted was that the Aztec Empire, this new political order, was not just a new political order, but a new sun, a new kind of creation. And that's what we see represented here on the center of the sunstone. Sorry, I'm going to work my way inward. So we see these two giant shukoatl or fire serpents wrapped around the edge of the stone. And then here with these discs, or with these rays projecting out of it, a kind of sun disk that's shining and sort of sending radiant light through the universe. With what we have inside are the 20 days of the 260-day divinatory calendar. And then inside it, a very complex figure that I can show you designed, the line drawing of here. And so what we see here is the names of the 4 previous suns, the 4 previous eras of creation. For each sun is named for the day on which it will end. We see those here in these squares around the edges. We begin with the year, with the sun for Jaguar, which ended when the people were eaten by wild beasts. We move then to the sun for Wind, destroyed by a hurricane, and the people were turned into monkeys. We turn then to for Rain, destroyed by a rain of fire, and people once again became animals. And then the 4th sun for Water, destroyed by a flood, the people became fish. But here, what we see in this image is that those four day signs, those 4 names of the 4 previous suns, join together to create altogether the name of the current sun, the Mushiya Son, a sun that is named for motion, Nawi Olin. And the prediction for this sun is that it would end in an earthquake. I've always wondered whether that was the 1985 Mexico City earthquake, was in some ways the end of the 5th Mushiya Son. And then we see a face here. It's hotly debated whether this is the face of the Earth Lord or the face of the night sun emerging out of that surface. And so that this whole thing together talks about the sun, but it talks about multiple suns, multiple eras of creation. And this was how the Aztecs understood the world, that the world would be destroyed and it would be created anew. Now, in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, we have another monument that tells almost the same story as the Sunstone. And so I hope that maybe you can begin to see, that you can recognize here for motion, Nawi Olin, the name of the present sun, and then moving around once again in counterclockwise motion, a very good direction for Mesoamerican movement. It's a motion that sets the sun in motion, that sets the world in motion. We go from for Jaguar to for Wind to for Rain to for Water. But then there are 2 other glyphs on this stone, which you can see in the galleries of the Art of the Ancient Americas here. So we have here the glyph 1 crocodile, 1 zipactli, which combined here with the square cartouche that tells us that we're in the year 11 Reed in the Aztec calendrical system, puts us very precisely on the day July 15th, 1503. And we know from other sources that that is the day of Motecuzoma's accession, the day Motecuzoma's coronation, the day that Motecuzoma becomes the Aztec Tlatoani, the Aztec Emperor. And so that this is a monument that talks not just about the 5 suns, but also about a particular moment of Aztec rulership. And yet what I'm showing you here is not the only part of this monument. If you've been in the galleries and you know to walk around the side of the monument, you can see that it's carved on all 4 of its edges with these very complicated figures. They're images of a deity that we call Tlaltecutli, the Earth Lord, or really the Earth Lord or the Earth Lady. Tecutli is a gender-neutral term for a noble. And what we see in this case is, in fact, the female version, the Earth Lady. She's crouching down with her knees touching her elbows like this, but we're actually seeing her from behind, perhaps, and then with a monstrous jaw that's split open to reveal tongues, teeth made of flint knives. Everybody with me seeing the Tlaltecutli? We're going to see more of her as time goes on. And so what we can see or think about here is that we have on all 4 sides of this monument the earth swallowing the sun. And that's a story that the Mushiya tell, that the earth swallows the sun at night, it travels through the underworld, and is reborn again the next day. And then if we look on the underside of the monument, something you can't do in the galleries right now, but that might change at some point. You see that the underside of the monument is carved as well, with the day one rabbit, the day in which the earth is created. And so the calendar stone in Mexico City is all very well and good, but here we get that same kind of ideology of creation, ideology of the multiple suns, expressed in 3 dimensions. Now, as it happens, this isn't the only Aztec sculpture that's carved on all available surfaces, that's carved such that you can't see all of the surfaces at once. And what I want to do for the rest of the talk today is talk more about these kinds of sculptures that are carved on all available surfaces, and particularly about their relationships to past civilizations of the Americas. Many of these forms, I'll show you, relate not to things that were happening only in the Aztec world, but to things that had happened hundreds or even 1,000 years earlier. And so that one of the things that the Aztecs are doing, I hope you'll agree by the end of today, as they're making these kinds of works, is they're thinking about past and imagining a moment in which they too will be part of someone else's past. So we've seen that stone of the force, or the stone of the 5 suns, and how it has the story about the earth moving through, or the sun moving through the earth, being swallowed by the earth lords. That program gets repeated on a number of other kinds of objects. And here I'm showing you one, a very small little Quauschikali, or offering vessel. It's currently in the Ethnologische Museum in Berlin. And so on the outside, you can see that it's made out of precious greenstone, but it's carved as if it's just a humble basket, pretending to be a different kind of material. And then if you look inside the vessel, you can see again that glyph for motion, Nawi Olin, the name of the present sun. The sun needs hearts, it needs blood to feed it, to keep it in motion. And so that's a perfectly appropriate thing to put on the surface of this vessel into which you might put hearts after having removed them from the chest cavity of a living victim. But what we see on the underside of this vessel makes it something else entirely. So we see again that same deity, Tlatelolco, the Earth Lady, once again in that same crouching position. This position is called Mamazotikak. It's a position of birth and generation. It's a really great position for giving birth, by the way, like gravity is on your side here. Highly recommended. But in this case, we know that also, and so she's lying on her back. And so think about it. We see her in this position, but lying on her back. And so that sun, Nawi Olin, the current sun, is being born out of her stomach. It's a kind of, which is another place where we see birth and generation happening in Aztec monuments. And so here we see that whole cycle once again. The sun is fed by hearts, it's eaten by the earth, and with more offerings of hearts, more offerings of blood, it's born daily out of the earth to travel through the sky. We get this sort of 3-dimensional story about cycles of regeneration. And here I'm showing you, Tlatelolco shows up in a few places in the manuscripts, and maybe that helps you make sense of these other kinds of very intense images of Tlatelolco that we can see carved on the undersides of all sorts of sculptures, great and small. So there are vessels for drinking alcoholic pulque. There's a box for probably auto-sacrificial implements for the king Motecuzoma. Both of these have Tlatelolco carved on their undersides. We see Tlatelolco too on the undersides of feathered serpents, images of perhaps simply the name glyph in 3 dimensions of the god Quetzalcoatl, a god of learning and rulership and wind and all sorts of things. We see Tlatelolco here in a male form that has overlays of the rain god on the underside of a 9-foot tall, 8-foot tall, 3-ton sculpture that we call the Coatlicue, snakes her skirt. And so in each one of these sculptures, there is a kind of dialogue between visibility and invisibility, between what we can see and what we can only know, perhaps if somebody's told you about it. What we can only know is on the undersides. And in other moments and in other places, I've been thinking about what kind of power that knowledge has. If you're the artist or one of the patrons, who knows about these things that lie hidden underneath? And when I started thinking about this topic, I thought that perhaps it was always Tlaltecutli that was carved on the undersides of Aztec sculptures, and so that you had something like the image of the earth pressing against the surface of the earth, and that there was this kind of beautiful symmetry to that. And I do think that that's true in some cases. But in fact, as I've thought more deeply about these objects and been able to do more research, it turns out that the thing that you're most likely to find on the underside of an Aztec sculpture are simply the coils of a serpent. So if you look at this object in the British Museum, and there's a mirror, so you can maybe see this if you go to the British Museum today, you can see how the scales of the serpent just coil inwards, and then there's little bits of paint that have been daubed onto the surface of that serpent. There's some ways in which the surface of the serpent, try to say that 3 times fast, is more elaborately carved, more elaborately worked than this very plain surface where we see only the serpent's mouth and the serpent's rattles. There are actually a lot of these objects. Here's one that's in the Field Museum, so you can see this in the Ancient Americas exhibit of the Field Museum in Chicago. There are a fair number of these serpents, and there are a lot of other things of the natural world that get carved in this way. We see representation of squashes that can work in all 3 dimensions. We've got this really lovely jaguar in the British Museum who has the sweetest little paws underneath. All the insects, everything gets continued all the way into the round. Here are just a few more examples, not in a little headless, but you get the sense, right? You know, the mammals, the bugs, the birds, all of them, their bodies just continue onto the underside, as if representing a thing in the round means that you have to carve it in the round. You know, if it has an underside, then the object, then its representation has to have an underside too. But that's not true of all Aztec sculpture. There are a number of Aztec sculptures that are plain on their undersides, with this seated deity that I'm showing you here from an offering in the Templo Mayor. Other objects have bases, and the bases are plain on their undersides. And so this isn't a kind of like naive realism, but instead a very deliberate set of choices that Aztec sculptors, often Mexica sculptors in that capital city of Tenochtitlan, are making. Because the picture quickly gets more complicated. So here we see what looks from the surface as if it's a very plain frog or toad. And on the underside, it has these, very sweet little paws, although they look a little bit more jaguar and like a little more human than most frogs of my acquaintance. But right in the center of the belly of the frog is an Aztec glyph. We call this glyph Chalchihuitl, or jade bead. And it's also in something like the place name for Chalco. And so is this saying something about this? Is this talking about the color of the toad being green, perhaps? Or is this talking about it being from Chalco? It's hard to know, but we've got a sort of interplay of text and image on the underside of this object. There's another very bruised and battered altar with maize cobs on it in Berlin, and then here's the twin in Mexico City. The one in Berlin is carved on its underside with a date, 7 Serpent. But 7 Serpent, Chicomecoatl, is the name of a maize god, or maize goddess, actually. And look at how the serpent has a rattle, has an ear of maize instead of its rattle. And so that we see here maybe something telling us precision about what kind of maize deity this altar is dedicated to. And just one more example showing that kind of interplay of text and image on the underside of an Aztec sculpture. Here we see a Xucoatl, a fire serpent. You remember those fire serpents on the edge of the calendar stone, on the edge of the sunstone. Here we have one that's simply coiled. It's got these little hands coming out. And what's carved on its underside is the name glyph of Moctezuma, he who grows angry like a lord. This is the Aztec Emperor who meets the Spanish and then is killed by them. And underneath them is the date, the year to read, which corresponds to 1507 in our calendar. And this little rope in that date glyph reminds us that to read was one of the times that the Aztecs celebrated a new fire ceremony, a ritual binding of the 52 years of a completed calendrical cycle. And so what's so interesting about this monument is the way that it talks differently to different audiences. That people who see only the upper part of the object might see that it's a shukoatl, and they might think about new fire. And if it's close to the time of 1507, they might remember that it was Motekuzzoma who sponsored the last new fire ceremony. But what's on the underside offers much more historical precision. It tells us Motekuzzoma, it tells us to read, it tells us 1507. It offers a kind of historical specificity that's not visible on the surface. It's almost as if the surface talks to people who are in the know, but the underside is imagining a future that might not remember that Motekuzzoma was responsible for the new fire ceremony of to read. And in fact, it's really striking that many of the different kinds of Aztec sculptures that are carved on their undersides are in fact archaizing. That is, that they refer to the empire of Teotihuacan, to the great city of Tula. They refer to cities that were already wonderful forgotten centers by the time that the Aztecs rose to power. Many of these genres of sculpture refer to the great city of Teotihuacan, up here just to the north of the Valley of Mexico. We're told that Motekuzzoma made a pilgrimage to Teotihuacan every 20 days. Although we're told that by the people of Teotihuacan, and nobody in Tenochtitlan says that, and so you kind of wonder about what local pride has to do with the kinds of historical accounts that we get. But it certainly was an important touchstone for the Aztecs. And so the coiled serpents, you'll remember, are the most common things carved on their undersides. And so I'm showing you on the left an Aztec example, and on the right 4 different Teotihuacan examples of coiled serpents. The Teotihuacan ones are much smaller, and they're plain on their undersides. I want to thank my friend, the curator, for helping me verify that. Matthew Robb, who did that for me. And you can see that there's definitely a family resemblance, as if somebody was thinking about these small and portable objects as they began making copies or making these new objects in the Aztec capital. The idea of offering vessels, or quauxicalli, that are shaped in the form of animals also has its origins at Teotihuacan, where we know a number of jaguar vessels, like this one right here. I haven't been able to tip this guy over yet to see whether it's carved on its underside or not. But when it was excavated, Edward Saylor describes him seeing painted spots at the very least on the underside, even if there's no carving. And so this is another object that's beginning to think about that kind of relationship between visible and invisible surfaces. The Aztecs think about eagles and jaguars as a kind of conceptual pair, that we have warriors of both of these orders. And so then even though I haven't found an eagle quauxicalli from Teotihuacan, I'd argue that these eagle quauxicallis, these eagle offering vessels from Tenochtitlan that are carved on their undersides, either with feathers of a bird or with an image of a seated deity, can also be traced back to a Teotihuacan, to the idea of Teotihuacan art. Here is another example that I hope begins to show you how firmly the Mexica were engaging with Teotihuacan's past. So this is an object from Teotihuacan made in the first half of the first millennium CE. It's a god, we don't know what the Teotihuacanos called him, but we know what the Aztecs called him. They called him Huehueteotl, the very, very old god, or the old god. And here you see an Aztec Mexica copy, we can agree, copy, right, of the Huehueteotl. And it too is carved on its underside, just with the continuation of the loincloth and the continuation of the kind of ornaments around the ankles and the clawed legs of this deity. There's an even more clear example here. Here I'm showing you an object once again from Teotihuacan, a kind of bust of a skeletal deity. Here's an Aztec rendition of the same subject that has, once again, a Tlaltecutli, an earth lord, on its underside. So when the Aztecs engaged with this Teotihuacan past, they began to carve these new renditions of these venerable objects with something on their undersides. Sometimes the Aztecs looked not simply to Teotihuacan here, but to the city of Tula Hidalgo, a little bit to the north, which had been a real power in Mesoamerica between about 900 and 1150 CE. And at Tula Hidalgo, we get a kind of sculpture called a chacmul. It's a terrible name. It's an invented name by Augustus Le Plongeon, who was sure that when he arrived at Chichen Itza, he'd found the last home of the lost tribes of Atlantis. But we've kept the name. It sticks to describe this very distinctive position of these figures holding a kind of receptacle on their bellies. And I hope you can see once again an undeniable family relationship between the objects at Tula, which are plain on their undersides, and the objects in Tenochtitlan, which, as you can see, are carved with these aquatic images, shells, and maybe bones and floating in the ocean. And here, on top of that all, once again, Tlaltecutli, the Earth Lord, wearing the goggles of the rain god. But what's even more exciting is that we can begin to pin down when this happens. So here is a chacmul from the Templo Mayor, the Aztec Templo Mayor, that dates to the second stage of construction at the Templo Mayor, sometime between 1374 and 1427. And it's not carved on its underside. And although it has this little ring of jade beads carved into its base, and it was placed on top of a cache that had in it jade beads and obsidian blades. Now we know that as they built the Templo Mayor again and again, 6 or 7 different construction phases over a 200-year period, the Aztecs the Mexica repeated their sculptural programs. And so here we see, it was just a head of a chacmul in the first stage, and then the chacmul of the second stage above. And I suspect that some of these other chacmuls that we see here are also from later stages of the Templo Mayor. And so we can pin down the moment where things start getting carved on their undersides to sometime after 1427, which is basically the period where the Aztec Empire really starts to expand, where rather than just being one city-state among other city-states in the Valley of Mexico, it moves on to being the power that rules them all, even if it is through a kind of alliance with other cities. Now we know that the Aztecs were really interested in finding the past. And so in that Florentine Codex, once again, this encyclopedia of the history of the things of New Spain, we get this advice about how do you find jade. How do you find jade? You look for a place where there's a little vapor, there's a little bit of a breath of vapor coming up at dawn. And maybe there you will find your jades, your Toltec beads. Or perhaps there you'll need to dig. And you'll dig and you'll find, maybe in a bowl, maybe in a box, you'll find jade. And it seems as if what this 16th century source is describing, we might call archaeology. That you go and you find a remnant of the ancient past, and it has jade beads within it, and that's how you take jade beads back to the capital. And we know that the Mexica are including all sorts of things from the distant past in the offerings at the Templo Mayor. And a mask that harkens back to the Olmec culture over here, first millennium BCE. A mask, I've never quite made up my mind whether this really is a Teotihuacan mask or whether this is an Aztec recreation of a Teotihuacan mask. But we have in so many places incontrovertible evidence. Here we see they're miniature Atlanteans, which has always felt like an oxymoron, but they're about yay tall. And you can see how they are clearly in dialogue with the Atlantean columns of Tula from several centuries earlier. So we know without a doubt that the Mexica are thinking about this past, that they are encountering ruined cities. And I think particularly about this photo in that light. This is a photo from Jorge Acosta's excavations at Tula in the 1940s. The Aztecs didn't see it, because these objects, these Atlantean columns like this, had been tipped off the edge of the pyramid into a pit and then buried around the time that Tula was abandoned, 1100, 1150 CE. And they weren't seen again until they emerged in Acosta's excavations in the 1940s. But you can see the way here that Acosta, a modern archaeologist, like those Aztec archaeologists, might have encountered the past, not perfectly preserved, but jumbled, turned over, moved around, overthrown. And so that when we think about a monument like the Stone of the Five Suns, like that Xucoatl commemorating new fire on the underside, I wonder if part of the connection between these archaizing objects and the idea of carving on the underside is precisely imagining a moment when the Aztec Empire itself would have fallen, when it would be a past, when other people would come to these objects not as they had been meant to be staged, but as they had been overturned by fire, by destruction, by earthquake, by the end of time. Now, that may not have been that anyone in the Aztec Empire could have foreseen that that was the outcome at this moment of first encounter 500 years ago. But the idea of the cyclicality, that one sun would follow another, that was an idea that people certainly were thinking about in 1519. And that they were thinking about again in the 1570s as the indigenous artists drew these images in the Florentine Codex. Diana Magaloni has argued that what we see in the illustrations of this book, which once again is a collaborative project between a Franciscan friar and a group of classically trained indigenous scribes. They received a proper classical education. They read Greek and Latin. They were Christians. At least they received a Christian education. And that what they are doing, she argues, in the images in this book, is imagining a sixth sun. A sun that is not the Mexica sun, but that is the Nahua Christian sun. It is a sun that represents a moment of survival and regeneration in a new world order. And so it's easy to think about the Spanish invasion and the period of Spanish colonization as a series of losses, as a series of destructions, as a series of declines. And it was all of those things. We think we're here on Halloween, but what we really are here is we're here the day before Dia de los Muertos, the day before Day of the Dead. And this year in particular, we have a lot of dead to remember. But it's a moment of recreation as well. This kind of energy, you can see this energy flowing out from these objects as they're being destroyed in a way that looks like energy emerging from a sacred bundle as it's opened and explored. And this is an image that's a wonderful kind of allegory of the Spanish invasion, of Spanish colonialization. So we have, you'll recognize, I hope, a Tlatelolco, an earth lady, carved on the underside. She was probably carved on the underside originally of an altar or an offering vessel of pretty large proportions that has then been carved into the shape of a column for something like a Catholic church. And so if you look at this first, it's a story about oppression, right? Here we have a church on top of indigenous culture. We have indigenous culture being remade and erased to make room for the Spanish. But if you think about it another way, Tlatelolco is where she should be and where she's always been, on the underside, hidden, in contact with the earth. And so this is a metaphor not just for the suffering of the conquest, but for the resilience and the survival and the reimagination of a new world that still continues to this day. Thank you.
Professor Brittenham has agreed to take a couple of questions. It'd be hard to see raised hands in here, so if we could maybe raise the lights just a bit. Okay, there you go.
Yes.
I have two questions. What is the name of the earthling? Can you kind of spell it?
Yes, Tlaltecuhtli, Tlaltecuhtli. I'm really sorry about that. The Spanish invented these terrible spelling conventions to represent Nahuatl sounds.
Okay, my second question is going back to the coronation stone.
Yes.
I understand the 4 jaguars and the 4 rain and the 4 water and how they all represent past times, the ends of past times.
Yes.
What I don't understand is where does July 15th come into it?
Okay, so we've got the 5 suns, right? And we're good with the 5 suns. Then we have up here the day 1 crocodile, and down here the year 11 reed. Okay, so let's have a moment of Aztec calendrics. The Aztec keep 2 different calendars. So there's a 260-day divinatory calendar that consists of 20 different day signs and the numbers 1 through 13. And I'm going to not produce, once I'm not going to produce what the next day in that calendar is, but we can have audience participation if anyone wants to rescue me. And so we can see that this 260-day calendar cycles again and again. It's a calendar that's really used for divination. The day of your fate is determined by the day on which you're born. There are all these almanacs that talk about, well, here is, if you're born on this day, this is a good fate. Go ahead and bathe the baby. This day is not so good. Let's maybe wait a couple more days and then bathe the baby, and then maybe the baby will have a better fate. It sounds suspiciously like baptism to the Spanish, and it really freaks them out. The other thing, why 260 days? 13 times 20, the Mesoamericans use a vigesimal counting system, fingers and toes, and so it's a good kind of Mesoamerican number. But something that Zelia Nuttall suggested first, it's basically a woman's gestational cycle. First missed period to birth. If we're talking about like 272 days, but if you get to like first missed period, that gets you to about 260 days. And so there's this way in which like the moment that you're conceived becomes something like the moment that you're born that shares a kind of fate. It's a really good number. So we've got that 260-day calendar. Then the Aztecs also have a 365-day solar calendar that consists of 18 20-day months plus 5 nameless days at the end of the year to get you up to something like the full rotation of a sun. And so you're going to have to take my word for it. The 260-day calendar and that 365-day calendar intersect once every 52 years. And so if it was 1 lizard, 11 reed on July 15th, 1503, it will not be 1 lizard, 11 reed again. No, wait, I've done that wrong. The 11 reed is the name of the year. But the years are named for the day on which they begin, which is part of that cycle. And so that we get, this gives us that precision about the year and then the day within that year, within that 260-day calendar. And so we're able to correlate that to a Spanish calendar based on, because I'm going to have to back up. We don't have the month in here, so forget that thing I told you about the 365-day months. They're there, they're not on this monument. What we have here is the day 1 lizard, which is the day of Montezumah's coronation. And what we have in the square cartouche there is 11 reed, the name of the year, which is named for the first day of the year. And that's 11 reed. So that tells us 1503, 1504. 1 lizard tells us July 15th within 1503, 1504. Now, it could be 52 years later, except that there's no Aztec Empire. It could be 52 years earlier, except that stylistically, it's got to be where it is. Does that make sense? I confused myself, and I confused you in the middle of it too. I apologize. Good. Yes?
There's a massacre you mentioned. If we're speaking about the same massacre, there's 2 different narratives that talk about how that massacre started, written by people with different agendas.
Yes.
So similarly, I'm wondering with the Florentine Codex, is there anything out there that confirms or contradicts what's in the Codex? There
are a lot of things in the Florentine Codex, and so I think it's there's no account that doesn't have its own particular history, right? Even just saying, here we are in the fifth sun, in the year 11 Reed, that's beginning to make a very polemical point, right? So there are parts of the Florentine Codex that are pretty incontrovertible. There's a whole book about indigenous names for different kinds of plants and different kinds of animals, and that's corroborated by a lot of other sources. There are there are accounts of the books. There's a book of gods. There's a book of rites. There's a book of history, and the outlines of what happens in those sources are also really very much like what we hear in other sources from other different kinds of points of view. There are moments where this is a very indigenous voice, right? That it's Sahagún, but Sahagún working in collaboration with a number of indigenous elders from the city of Tlatelolco and in other places. And it sometimes one of the things that people are thinking about often is like, who's talking to people from which city-state? Where do you get the Tlatelolcan version? Where do you get the Texcocan version? Different city-states tell different versions of the story. It's a very indigenous identified story, right? That when we come to book 12 in the story of the Spanish conquest, it's the story. It centers a lot of people whose names never appear in Cortés or Bernal Diaz's account, right? And it presents a kind of bewildering violence rained down again and again and again. Now, Cortés and Bernal Diaz, at Cholula are saying, well, somebody told us that people were plotting against us, and so we decided by stratagems that we'd better kill them first. And whether you believe that story or not, I think there are things that we can't know, or I think there are things where we can't resolve them necessarily from the text that we have alone. We'd have to look for other kinds of evidence as well. Yes.
So we understand now that Mexica imagined themselves and got all these things from all these other great civilizations that they were encountering hundreds of years later, Tula and City of Gods that they were imagining. I'm curious as to how much that narrative of like these great city-states, these great gods that we're imagining is present in a similar way in other city-states, whether it's like their allies in Texcoco or whether it's like their rivals in Tlaxcala. Is this imagination of the art of the sun and there are these cities around us a thing that was only present in the Mexica Empire? Is it present in Triple Alliance friends, or is it present all across the Mesoamerican psyche and
That is a fantastic question. So the question is about how much this account I've just given you is really specific to the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, and how much this is something that other Mesoamerican people might give at the same time. What I can tell you is that the carving on the undersides of sculptures as a systematic practice happens only in Mexico Tenochtitlan. Every object that I've been able to identify provenance of, and I can map, comes from within 2 kilometers of the Templo Mayor. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that, but they look like imitations. They look like somebody's heard the story and has decided to make their own thing, rather than extensions of the same tradition. We really need to do a better job of sorting Aztec sculpture and understanding what is Mexico from Tenochtitlan and what is from other city-states around the valley, and I'm really hoping somebody's going to do that work. I don't know. I suspect that everybody has a slightly different relationship to the past, right? Texcoco is another city-state that claims direct descent from the rulers of Teotihuacan, right? And so they don't need to maybe reinvent themselves in this way. They have other ways of claiming that kind of lineage. Mesoamericans, generally speaking, are aware of their past in different ways. But this particular practice feels to me something that's very specifically imperial and very specifically late imperial. That it gets started probably around the reign of Ahuitzotl, if I had to, maybe Tizoc, but not much earlier than that. Their names are on the undersides of carved vessels, nobody else's are. So this is a part of a much longer work. Any other questions? Yes?
So on this story here, they have the days that the police were.
Mm-hmm.
You talked
Yes.
The Aztec kind of assign lengths of time to the previous ages, so that they have an idea or an expectation of how long theirs would last.
That's a wonderful question, and there's sources that give really different answers to this. So that there are, we get like in the Historia de los Mexicanos por sus pinturas, in the Histoire du Mexique, we get different accounts of the multiple eras of creation. And in some cases, they have numbers associated with them. In other cases, they don't. When they do have numbers, the numbers don't match. And so I'm uncomfortable trying to map, well, the third sun is Teotihuacan and the second sun is the Olmecs. I'm uncomfortable doing that. Although my colleague Helen Burgos Ellis has argued that you get a pretty good record of indigenous agricultural history in those accounts of the four sons, that people eat different kinds of the things in the four sons, and she thinks she sees people talking about the domestication of maize in the history of those different sons. And so I think that there is really important historical information to be gotten out. Myth history is it's a distinction that we like to make, but it's not actually that straightforward. I think that there is useful information to be gotten out of this. For the Aztecs, though, when they speak about the past, they speak about Toltecs often. And Toltecs, we've now called the people who lived at Tula Hidalgo Toltecs. But when I read what the Aztecs, or what people in the Florentine Codex and other texts like that say about the Toltecs, I don't think they're just talking about Tula Hidalgo. I think they're talking about Teotihuacan. I think they're talking about a city where Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was a feathered serpent was the ruler. It's a past place. It's a wonderful place, right? The buildings are thatched with feathers, and the corn grows so big, and the cotton grows in all these different kinds of colors. It's a place of bounty. Artists are called Toltecs too. And so it's a place of creation, a place of generation, and that there's then again that kind of association with the past. But that question of what did the Aztecs know about their past that we don't know? And what do we think we know about the Aztec past that they didn't know? This is something that we still have so much more work to think about. Any other questions? Yes?
So I have a question. I got an impression that your argument for this presentation was more of a cyclical understanding of Mesoamerica, right?
Yes.
So then my question of clarity is, why did you start with colonialism? And the reason for that is because I understood as an undertone of the argument that colonialism is part of this cyclical understanding of how Mesoamerica saw themselves. I just want to get clarity if colonialism is part of a cyclical cycle within a civilization.
Well, that's an interesting question. So why did I start with 1519? And the answer is because we're in 2019. And it's really on my mind right now. I mean, I've been reading Cortez again and thinking about how did he violate so many human rights norms, even of his own moment, in such a short time? I think there are certainly moments of colonialism in the Mesoamerican past before the Spanish get there, right? So the Aztec Empire that grows so quickly, it's a slightly different kind of colonialism because it doesn't come with the kind of demographic collapse that comes along with the Spanish invasion, right? But one of the reasons why Cortez is able to move so quickly is because he has so many allies who either have been feeling the press of Aztec armies but haven't yet been integrated into the empire, or he allies with city-states where people within living memory remember not being part of that empire, right? Everything that we see here grows within about a century before the Spanish invasion. And so that's a completely different thing from Spanish colonialism, and it's important to stress that. When I present an account of colonialism and a sixth son being a way that people tried to understand the colonial era, I think that, guided by scholars like Diana Magaloni, I'm trying to recover an account that people in the 16th century might have given. And that's an account that's not necessarily naturalizing colonialism or saying that this is celebrating colonialism, but it's instead trying to reckon with the way that the world has been taken apart. We've not seen a destruction, like the invasion of the Americas. The demographic collapse, if we're talking, the debate is, is the population in 1600 5% of what it was in 1500, or is it 15% of what it was in 1500? The Black Death maybe kills 40% of the population. What happens in the Americas is of another magnitude. And so when we find things like the Florentine Codex that are made in a really different cultural moment, the past is gone, the past is not coming back, and yet some of the past is still surviving. And how to think about that is a challenge for us today too. Yeah.
Yeah, as a historian, for Latin American, it's really important, I think, to define what colonialism in Mesoamerican definition can mean, and colonialism from a Eurocentric concept. Because I think trying to, expose something like this seems kind of scary in the sense that we're trying to convey an argument that colonialism is part of a cyclical cycle that is known, and that is part of, an everyday, cycle in civilization. And so I think it's really important to stress out the difference and not to use Western terms to understand Mesoamerican history. It's really important.
Agreed. I certainly believe that the Spanish invasion was a disastrous rupture, and that what came afterwards is radically different from what had come before. My intent in some ways is to stress survivance and to stress the resilience of indigenous populations under terrible, terrible conditions.
Well, I think we should probably end there. Let us thank Claudia Brittenham again for a wonderful lecture. Thank you.